Hello, my name is Mario Platt, and today we'll be talking about embracing the odds, how to build secure products for startups specifically. So before we go into the theme, I'd like just to introduce myself. So I started hacking back in 1998, and I did have a background. I do have a background in system administration and telco infrastructure. Security roles that I've had started, my first full-time job in security was penetration testing, but I've had roles in operations, security engineering, security product management, and I've been mostly focusing on governance, risk and compliance since 2012. And I was an independent consultant for about 2.5 years, where I worked a lot with startups, with UK government and healthcare institutions. I'm a strategy advisor for Practical DevSecOps, and I've recently joined Cloud Margin as a head of InfoSec. I'm also the course creator for a course called DevSecOps for Leaders, and I recently also gave some training for OWASP AppSec Days on compliance at the speed of DevOps, introducing practices such as compliance as code, using OPA, Open Policy Agent, and Chef Inspect. And I'm also a speaker and blogger on security strategy, world mapping, Cynefin framework, safety and resilience engineering, social practice theory, and many other nerdy things that come across my eyes and that I find interesting. So you can access www.securitydifferently.com, and you'll see a big list of my rants that I like to write relating to security and how to apply knowledge from other areas to security practices. So what we'll be talking about today is about the problem, right? So what are the odds? There's insecurity overall, and I was even part of a talk with that theme. We talk a lot about beating the odds. Okay, but in this presentation, I would like to take a different view. How can we embrace the odds? Okay, knowing the challenges and the constraints that we have in startups, how can we embrace those and still do security? So it is said that most organizations have a 1:100 ratio between security staff and engineers. Okay, so if you go by this usual rule that we see in the market, we can easily understand how this disproportionately affects startups. Right? So a lot of startups are doing their work to get to 100, even when they get to 100-ish, it's still, according to these numbers, you would only have one security person, even if you're at a place where you are already have 100 employees or 100 engineers. But the problem is not just 1:100, it's also what it means to do security effectively. And this requires a multitude of skills that a few individuals will have, all in the same person. And the ones who do are likely to be expensive. So it requires a deep technical understanding of how things can go wrong. It requires communication and persuasion. So it's not just about building security features into the product. It's also about how we communicate with if we're in a B2B, how we communicate with customers, how we communicate potentially with regulators and other parties that may want to audit us, and the executive leadership, any board of directors at times, and also internally. So how we talk with product managers, how we talk with engineers, etc., and how we persuade them to work on security things. It's also about balancing skills. Right, so it's someone, even if you only have the opportunity to have one security person, and they come in with all of these great things that they like to be doing, we still have deadlines to make. We'll probably have a few key customers where the whole of our current revenue is sitting on, and more often than not, what I see is some key customers kind of holding a big weight in terms of how decisions are made in your product backlog. So you're likely to find yourself at any point in time with the next 3, 6, 9, or 12 months ahead already with your whole capacity of things you had to commit to get a big customer, which is important for you as an organization, and you know from a business point of view that's what's going to leverage you to achieve bigger and better things. But you know that you're sacrificing short-term power of decision making when you get into those deals. But this is one of my favorite blog posts that you can see at the bottom, which says, "Why do you don't need a chief security officer?" From a startup perspective. I'm going to read the quote because I think it's really powerful the way it's written. "My observations are that it can be harmful to introduce dedicated security employees too early at a startup. This introduction of a specialized role to solve a horizontal problem will often cause early fragmentation and organizational deaths. Instead, startups do better off getting short-term guidance from external expertise and tasking existing engineering talent with security projects." Okay. This I find to be really, really true. And I'm going to provide a comment after I read this second part also on that same blog post, which is, "Security experts are useful in identifying risks and prioritizing mitigations. These skills are not needed to point out the earliest offenses at most companies. If brought on too early, this expertise is wasted when most early defense work is now very well known, even among non-experts." Okay, and this is really the point that I'd like to get across. Trying to bring in security people too soon, not only do you have the problem that because it's such a wide area, and I would say usually a spectrum between more governance-oriented skills like going through audits, compliance, and all those things, and on the other hand, the actual engineering work to make your products secure and with security features. What you will find is that it's not very easy to find one individual that can cover the whole spectrum. Right? So you run the risk of being biased towards one of them, either someone just getting in and doing work on behalf of of your engineering team, and that is going to affect you in the long run, because what will happen is people will always see it as someone else's job, right? So security will not, you will not be giving yourself the opportunity for security to evolve as something that the teams own, right? And when we think about the security unicorns, that's one of the things that sets them apart. So they know that security is part of their role, and security is there to facilitate, to help manage, but not to do it for them. Right? And if you bring in security people too early in your startup, you get immediately that us versus them. They do the security things, I focus on the other stuff, and that is going to come back to bite you in the long run, from a culture perspective. And also, it doesn't allow the teams to actually build. It's not only about the culture; it's also about the skills, right? So if you start building your capabilities with security included, you will get the benefits of more integrated work and not the siloed thinking of bolting on security things on top of the engineering that you're already doing. Right? So a fully integrated approach will always be more beneficial to you in the long run. But so what are the constraints when you talk about security as security in startups? So I usually divide them to discuss in two areas, one on expertise and governance, and the other one on resources and structure. And that's what we'll be covering as part of this presentation. So on expertise and governance, we have technical practices, policies, patterns, and references. And on resources and structure, we're going to have money and attention, which is the biggest resource, in my opinion, in organizations. But before we get into all of that, I'd just like to make a point on scaffolding. Right? I know that you're probably not thinking that far ahead right now, but there are two things that I believe are the core of good security scaffolding in organizations, that if they exist, security can leverage, and if they don't exist, it's resources better spent on working on these before you start focusing too much on security. And those are implementing or fostering a culture of quality assurance, where people agree jointly what quality means, and you work on integrating unit tests and quality assurances directly into the development process. And the other one is how you manage business risk. So your business opportunities, what features you decide to work on first and why, how you approach getting more customers. So all those aspects about managing the business risk side of things. If these two things are already in place, then security can leverage them. And if they don't exist, then it will always be an uphill battle, because we're going to be trying to compete for resources directly with engineering, and not thinking in terms of quality assurance or business risk, which is ideally how we are approaching the discipline of security. So if you fix or improve these first, you get better return on investment. So if you work a lot on implementing good processes of quality assurance into your development process, then you can, doing the security stuff is just a little add-on, right? So if you do good project risk management or business risk management, those are also things that you can leverage. And you always get better results longer term if you've got these first, and you make sure that security is adding to these and not kind of a substitute or something that is being thought completely separate from them. So I like to use, this is a kind of an inspired approach, but how we approach strategy is also important from a security point of view. So, and I like to use this type of analogy. So, a symbiotic or a parasite, they live off the host directly, right? So they attach themselves to their hosts, and whilst the host lives and does their thing, they know that they can successfully coexist with it, obviously if it's not killing the host. Hyenas live off of the land, right? They live off what the apex predators leave them. So in the case of hyenas, things that the bigger predators don't go for, that's usually what they scavenge on. So they're not the top predator in their environment, so they'll tend to avoid direct fights. So yeah, they kind of live off of everything else. And finally, we have the apex predators. Right? In the apex predators, they basically do whatever they want because they can't fail until the conditions of the environment change. Right? So a good example, a technology example, is how about 6 months ago there came an article on some business media saying that Apple and Microsoft are the most agile companies on the planet, and that's why they are so successful. For those of us understanding apex predator theory, we know that is not the case. Right? Until the whole environment changes, they can be as slow and bureaucratic as they want, but the whole environment is geared towards supporting them. Right? So it's not possible until the conditions of the environment change for them to fail. Right? In here we could use the analogy on Blockbuster versus Netflix, all those things that until the environment itself changes, Blockbuster was never going to lose what they had. But once they do, it usually tends to be fast and a bit catastrophic. So how can we use these three kind of categories to typologies better to think about how to do security strategy? So this is how I like to think about it. So every time I start working with an organization, I tend to try and think of security transformation using one of these typologies. Right? I either find a way which is the preferred way of integrating into other people's transformations. So I go and understand what other people are doing in the business, the type of transformation that we are aiming for, and I try and identify the affordances that are going to be given to me because of the nature of that change that they're doing on how I can leverage to do security. Right? And that is least painful. I completely integrate into what people are doing as opposed to coming up with my own brilliant ideas. The other part is the hyena strategy, in which I can learn how either to recover from incidents and situations, or even think in terms of inputs and outputs. So using either inputs into other processes or outputs of existing processes or procedures, for instance, to use for my security thing, as opposed to saying we need to come up with this completely new process or this completely new initiative to try and do something to do with security. Right? So really understanding the environment and seeing what I can live off of. And finally, the apex predator approach, where I need to look. I've tried to do one of the other two. I couldn't find an effective way of doing so, so I'm going to have to set my own plans. I'm going to have to compete for resources. Right? So we know that it's going to be £1,000 for the organization, and I'm going to have to find a way of there are 50 or 70 of them to hopefully to be used for security things that we're going to need. And the key on this is to understand that there's an energy gradient to all of this. Like the more we can use a symbiotic type approach, the less challenge we are going to get from the organization itself, and the easier it will be to do security. And this for startups is particularly important, right? Because you don't have resources just laying around. You are running a lean or very lean organization. So the more you can identify the opportunities to completely integrate the security work into what people are already doing, the better it's going to be for you. So I like to use heuristics to talk about security. And again, going back to Ryan McKeegan's approach, the things that are the basics to set up the base defenses, they're well known, right? And I like to use these four heuristics that are applicable both to software engineering and infrastructure engineering teams, which is check your dependencies. So for software engineers, it can be checking their NPM packages, it can be their Maven packages, or whatever package management they use in trying to identify any known vulnerabilities with the dependencies they're using. For infrastructure teams, it can be choosing Docker container images and checking that they don't have any known vulnerabilities either. Protect your secrets, so not putting your secrets into code, trying to find a better way, environment variables, or ideally through a proper secrets management solution, and what to do about it. Scan your code. Again, both software engineering and infrastructure engineering can benefit from this heuristic. It can mean doing with a Sonar Cube and validating that you don't have any known programming errors in your code, or if you're using something like CloudFormation or for infrastructure teams, CloudFormation or Terraform, that you are checking that the code is secure, that you're not deploying S3 buckets if you're an AWS house with public permissions if they shouldn't be like that, right? And finally, harden your config. So either from a software point of view on making sure that your Nginxes are properly configured and secured. It can be your S3 buckets, your RDS databases, whatever that you're using, making sure that you have a validation that the way you're configuring it is being made securely. Right? And these are the four things that I like to do. Right? They're simple. We're going to talk later about how to approach this even with open source. Whenever we start talking about security in a startup, I ask these four questions. Have you checked your dependencies? Have you protected the secrets? Have you scanned your code? Have you hardened your config? Right? And these are the four security things that we can do. And this will, for a startup, it should cover up to 90% of your requirements of the things that you should be doing, right? Or at least you can then define that you have a sensible baseline if you're applying it consistently, that you are doing security things and you've got the evidence to prove it. In terms of organizational practices, I like to divide these in two, right? Which serve different time spans. So on one hand, the people that are for management, it's important to understand the risks that may happen. And for that, I like to use the Open Information Security Risk Universe. You've got the link at the bottom, which allows us to standardize how we approach risk identification. So it has a bunch of resources and some tables that you can use, even if you don't have a big risk expert in the room. And you can first thing, who or what can cause a risk to materialize, so the source of risk, and you normalize it. What events can occur that would cause consequences, so the risk events, and what possible harms can come from those events, so what are the risk consequences. This gives you a good way to think about the risks that may affect your organization and to normalize the data within them, so you can then aggregate and do all those good things. So this is an example that Phil Huggins and Rob Oldham, when they presented the Open Information Security Risk Universe, they presented this example. So using the example of the Equifax data breach, so we've got a source, we've got an event, we've got some consequences, and we try and define the risk scenario in a business narrative, right? So if Equifax had done this risk scenario previously, before they were breached, they could word it as, we hold personal information for our consumers. This may become available through the website if we do not adequately protect our code or third-party components. And this may result in regulatory action, fines, and reputational damage. So if you start building your risk register to capture these kinds of things, then it becomes really easy to scale. Right? And you can use what I usually end up doing is create risk management workflows as a Jira project to make it easy to integrate and to map to other types of tickets that are being created in the organization. And you have one place where you can map all your data. So for management, we have risk management practices, and for knowledge workers, so for all our engineering teams, we have threat modeling. In threat modeling, you can start very simply. It's about asking 4 questions consistently, right? What are we building? So this helps you to set the scope, and not as happens in a lot of risk approaches, and depending on the security professional that you have with, is the problem of scope creep, right? So people start identifying all of the things on the planet that can go wrong or could go wrong, as opposed to focusing on the thing that is being built, right? So this first question is really to narrow down the scope and to avoid scope creep. The second question is what can go wrong. So we can use then resources such as OWASP Top 10 and a couple of other things to try, or even Stride, the mnemonic, to try and think about the different things that can go wrong. Then what are we going to do about it? So what mitigations can we put in place so we reduce the likelihood of it going wrong? And finally, how good of a job have we done? So this is about at least two dimensions. One of them is the breadth. So how complete is the threat model that I've built? And the second one is usually what I usually say is the most the part that is most overlooked in terms of the ability to scale security programs, which is the continuous validation. So it's not good enough to just put in a mitigation. If you're not adding a test that validates in your pipeline that the validation, that the mitigation that you've put in place is still valid and is still working, then it's you will not be allowing for the long term for changes to be made safely. Because what that means is if 2 weeks down the line an engineer comes along and makes a change where the mitigation is no longer valid or is no longer active or working, then you won't know about it unless you built into the process this continuous checking that the mitigation you've put in place is still being effective. I usually suggest looking at Jeff Hill's Tutamantic Rapid Threat Model Prototyping, which is a really, really good methodology that I like to begin with, because you can time-bound the activities, and it has a rules-based system which looks at elevation of privilege type threats first. And even if you're doing it time-bound, then you know that at least even if you went that far, you know that you took the most critical types of vulnerabilities first, or try to identify them. The other aspect is about policies. So I've got a really huge rant about security policies being a business liability, so that you can find the link at the bottom. But particularly for startups, you really need to be sensible about your policies. Right? So there's usually a blindness to the gap between policy and practice. that leads to unfunded or inappropriate commitments. And this is the problem when you bring in a consultant or you go buy some ISO 27001 policies off the shelf and just say, this is how we do things. That's probably not how you do things, right? And if it's not how you do things, then you're creating a business liability on day one when you really probably didn't have that need, right? If you were just to put in paper the things that you can commit to doing, then that's your policy. You may or may not be meeting all of the requirements of 2701. And also remember that from 2017 or 2018, all of the controls on Annex A, they're no longer completely required. So everything needs to come from the risk analysis. So if you are performing those the risk identification that I told you before, and you're being consistent in basing your policy statements out of the outcomes of those risk identification exercises, then you're good. Right, you're just putting on paper in the things that you do, and then obviously, particularly if you're in the B2B space, then there may be the concern or the question that some of your customers may have an expectation about particular policies, but then that's something that you can negotiate, or you can see what is the actual commercial need for the security, and not just because that's what ISO 2701 says, right? So I like to be very clear about the difference between those two buckets. But what's the alternative into building policies that actually make sense? So the first one is understanding frontline work. So understanding in terms of your business, not just in the engineering side of things, but depending on your type of startup, what do the front lines of your organization actually do, digital or not? And in 2020, we now have the ability with policy as code, compliance as code frameworks to actually query our IT environment before setting policy. So even if you're not starting from a complete greenfield environment, go check how compliant you are against some of the best practices and set policy after you understand how big the gap is. Never set policy statements without understanding how big the gap is. Right? Just doing things based on best practices is not good enough. You really need to understand your environment, what you currently have, so that you can manage those gaps, and you're always aware of how big that gap is. That doesn't mean that you should not have policy statements that tell you things that you're not currently doing, but that's where risk management comes along. You identify the gap, you say, this is my policy, this is what I'm currently doing, and this is my risk mitigation plan. And at least you are in the position where whenever someone asks, you can say, okay, this is my policy because it is my policy. This is a risk that I've identified against meeting that policy, and this is my mitigation plan that is going to take me 2 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever may be the case, right? But then that's you managing business risk as opposed to just putting nice words on paper and hoping that no one comes and checks. And finally, basing policy and control objectives on outcomes of risk identification and threat modeling, right? So doing these two activities, working with the teams, getting their feedback, understanding exactly what it is that you do, and taking it from there. And then we have patterns and references. So this is what I like to, in NCSE has a great list of Affinity Patterns. So if you, I'm not going to talk about each of them, you can check the link below. But the idea being that trying to avoid doing these 6 patterns, right? Their browser, management bypass, back-to-back firewalls, building on-prem solutions on the cloud, uncontrolled and unobserved third party. So when you've got people directly accessing the data and not going through all of the systems. And the problem with the one we're talking about is the problem with the unpatchable system, right? So when you build your application, that's the image at the bottom, where every time you want to do an upgrade to an app, you basically need to bring your whole system down, right? And that's not the way to build systems in 2020. You've got better design patterns now. Also, in terms of patterns and references, and this will be, I'm going to show 3 different, well, 2 different approaches in the next few slides, but this will always depend on the type of stakeholders you have within the organization. So OWASP SAM, the software assurance maturity model, is really good when you have people that are more kind of assurance or audit oriented, right? So you're going to have 5 business functions and you're going to have some security practices that go along with it. So business functions are things like governance, like design, and then you've got some different security practices within them. And if you really want to, if you need to be that mature about how you approach security now, if that's the right answer for you as an organization, some B2B spaces may need to go down that route sooner rather than later. Then you can use OWASP SAM to define your roadmap for the next year or two on what types of practices that you will want to improve. If you want to keep it more down to earth in terms of the things that we should be doing now, then you've got the OWASP proactive controls. So you can see them on the right. It's basically, that is the list. If you're doing those things, you're doing good security from an application perspective, right? So it's the most important control categories that all projects should be meeting. So access controls, protecting data, monitoring and logging and monitoring, handling errors and exceptions. So all those things that make up for good security practices in your application. And this, again, is something that you can say, this is how I approach it, this is what I'm currently meeting, what I'm not, and help define your roadmap with the different teams in your organization on the work that needs to be done. Then we also have the OWASP ASVS standard, Application Security Verification Standard. So the ASVS has 14 domains. So it covers a lot of different things. The same that we talked about in proactive controls, but it's kind of a bigger list. So we've got things such as business logic, we've got input validations, encodings. So we've got all those good things that happen in good secure applications. What it also does is it has built into it 3 assurance levels. So the first level is really a defensible baseline, a low assurance. So everything in ASVS level 1 should be easily integrated into your CI/CD as something that is continuously checked. I think it should really be a baseline that you work to. Then level 2 is for applications containing sensitive data. And level 3 is for applications that are critical. So they are governing high-value transactions, sensitive medical data, or environments that have a high need of trust, such as government and those kinds of things. The good thing about ASVS is that because it's kind of a giant spreadsheet, right? You can download a CSV file that tells you these are the control objectives, these are the different things within each of them. It's good for the box tickers, right? The more compliance-oriented that like to tick boxes. So that's kind of an approach that they'll be used to. And you also can use that document in lots of different ways, which I particularly like. You can use it as a metric, so kind of understanding where teams are and kind of the guiding post of what you'd like or what you want to do. You can just use it as general guidance. So when, let's say that your team is working now, is going to start working on the session management part of your application. So you can just go to the SVS, you go to the session management section, and you define some security requirements from that list to add to your roadmap, to your sprint. You can use it for procurement. So if you are going to procure any outside applications, you can use it. Okay, this is what good security is. Tell me how your application meets these requirements. You can use it as a guide for automated tests. So the things that you like, continuous validation that are working in a particular way. And you can also use it for training, right? So to making sure that your engineers get training which is consistent with these 14 domains, right? In particular on training, and also to provide you with a clear view on what it is that, on what these things that are sometimes abstract, more requirement setting, governance, that make it less clear and a bit more fuzzy to actual engineers who like specifications, you can use OSS Cheat Sheets. So, and the good thing about all of these projects is that if you go to the OSS Cheat Sheets website, you've got the actual mapping back to OWASP proactive controls, OWASP SAM, and the OWASP ASVS. So it's not just about saying, look, here's these kind of governance related words that someone put together. You can actually say, go to the cheat sheet that is going to have a mapping against these, and you can actually see code examples in multiple languages. You're going to have some explanations in rules written by programmers for programmers, and you can provide actual examples that your teams can leverage to build all of these wonderful and secure things that we've been talking about. So this is, in terms of patterns and references, these are the key resources that I like to use. So making sure we're not using those, we're not using anti-patterns, and leveraging the OWASP resources that are going to help us along our journey as we evolve our security capabilities within the things that we're building. Then we come to the section on resources. So a big part of the challenge that I hear with particularly with startups is that you're probably not going to have much money for security, right? So you need to find ways that you can do it as best you can, but trying to be as efficient as possible, because you're likely not to be in the position where you have loads of money and can afford to be spending lots of resources on security. Right? So one of the things that I like to do is looking at going back to the list of 4 security things that we were talking about. So check your dependencies, protect your secrets, scan your code, and harden your config. Is to look at both open source and cloud native technologies that you can leverage to actually help you do these things. So from an application point of view, on checking dependencies, we can use OWASP dependency check, NPM audit. From NPM 6.0, audit is already integrated and will let you know if you have vulnerable dependencies, or if you're using Python code, you can use safety, for instance. From the infrastructure side of things, so you can look more into your Docker containers, for instance, checking your dependencies. You've got Aquatrivy, Encore, or Claire. All good products. Trivy is probably, and Encore are relatively simple. Claire is a bit more complicated to set up. In terms of protecting your secrets, so one place where they shouldn't be is directly in your code. And obviously then you've got some those 3 in order of preference. So starting with the environment variables or on configuration management systems, or ideally in full-on secrets management systems, which is going to be the most secure way to go about it. And then scan your code. So you can use SonarQube with the security plugin, Bandit for Python, Gas for Go, Brakeman for Ruby. Or you can use, if you're using infrastructure as code, you can use Chekhov, which is the one I prefer for checking Terraform code, TF-Lint, which kind of does the same thing. If you use Kubernetes, you can use KubeBench. There's now some checks for the managed versions within Azure and in the AWS and GCP. And you can use that to check the hardening settings of your Kubernetes clusters. And finally, hardening your config. So you can use Ansible playbooks. You can use Open Policy Agent, which personally is my preferred way of going about it, because you have not only Open Policy Agent, which is a cloud native foundation project that you can use to leverage direct integration with a lot of those projects, but you also now have, and you can use from the development cycle, so with ConfTest, that you can actually run automated checks every time someone runs a build. But you can also use the same policy documents for your admission control on your Kubernetes clusters. So you can even implement a flow like you start with conf test until you've got a confidence that people are doing the right thing. And once you start getting few alerts on those hardening settings not being in place, you can actually make it the control directly in your Kubernetes clusters, so that if things don't meet that policy, they don't even get deployed, right? And you kind of can do iteratively implement and improve your controls like that. Chef Inspec or HashiCorp Sentinel, which are all policy as code languages. So this is how you can. Not having money to do these things is not a valid excuse, right? There's a lot of projects and a lot of mileage that you can go to just using open source. Obviously, with open source, things such as managing false positives, etc., may require a bit more of you or your team on getting to grips and learning a new tool. The good news is, if you first try and do as much as possible with open source, then if you do decide that you need to go to a commercial product, then at least your team already has an understanding of how the thing works, and you can say, okay, I had these pain points with those open source things, I need to find a solution that fixes those, right? And at least it gives you a comparison, something to compare to, as opposed to just going to a commercial thing and assuming that's how the whole industry works, which typically isn't. DevSec.io, you can actually download inspec profiles to check compliance, and you've got for all of those things that are on the right, SSH, Linux, Windows, MySQL, blah blah, the actual configuration management on Ansible, Chef, and Puppet to actually fix those compliance settings, right? And you can just download and use them straight away. And lastly, the issue on managing attention, right? So there are two big things on managing attention, which I like to differentiate, which is visibility and traceability. So visibility, I call it as using metadata in tickets to provide product level view of security work identified. So either outputs of tooling, threat modeling, audit points, customer requirements, whatever may be the case. So you enrich your data in Jira or whatever you use for case management, and you enrich those with metadata that you can then tag and actually understand what type of security work is going through the organization. That's important to provide visibility, to do things such as aging tickets. So we've identified something 6 months ago. Are the product owners feeling empowered to prioritize or not the security work? And at least you start getting some data on how security is actually happening or not happening in your environment, and where the work is coming from, right? Which is also important. And the other part is the traceability. So what I also find in a lot of startups that I've worked previously with is that they actually do some good security things, but because they don't have any traceable mappings back to standards, policy requirements, or compliance standards, whatever may be the case, they end up in a position where they are not able to articulate the good stories of the work they've already done. Right. So having this thinking that when we work on access control, we tag it with the ISO standard, the ISO section equivalent, or the policy with the policy identifier that it relates to, or a contractual requirement, and use it as metadata again to enrich that data set. Then when someone comes along and they ask, do you do these things, then you've got a mapping telling you exactly what those are, or even to identify risks, right? So all these are all the two things that really help you keep track, not only keep track of the security work happening or not happening, but also it helps you tell a story of security standards, of policy, of governance back to some of your customers which may like to speak that language. And also on the issue of attention, is doing security things time bound, right? You are probably not in a place where you can just spend 2 or 3 sprints doing security stuff unless you've got a commercial opportunity depending on it. So we should define clear criteria for security work. So you define, for instance, we do a risk analysis under these conditions, and that can be I'm doing a new feature that is processing personal information of our customers, or that is dealing with high value transactions that our platform managers. So you define those criteria, that's up to you, but you ensure that you didn't do these appropriately, and that all the product owners, etc., that they know that when the thing they're wanting to do meets these criteria, then they need to spend that hour doing that thing, because we need to keep evidence, we need to think this way more than anything. And the same thing for threat modeling, right? So 1 hour, start a new feature, or we're working on whatever criteria we think makes sense for your business, and we spend 1 hour that week on that sprint doing threat modeling. If we only get to identify two or three threats, look, it's what you got. At least you've got it documented that you've done the activity, you've identified these things, then our tickets on your backlog to be managed, right, and delivered. And if you do this consistently, then it builds up, right? It's not it's like, I like to use the example with dieting. It's not because you ate the salad today that you're going to lose weight. It's because you do that consistently over a big period of time, and then eventually you get to where you want to be, right? So it's the same thing with threat modeling. Just ensure that you are consistent applying these criteria and doing it iteratively and incrementally, and then over time you're going to see that you actually get pretty good, and your teams get pretty good at thinking about the threats that can that apply to the systems that you're building. And the main thing is also ensuring you retain evidence that you've performed this. So it's not good enough just to do it. You want to be in the position where if someone asks, you can say, okay, here's the evidence that we've actually been doing all of these wonderful things. Another thing to note is on recovering from incidents, right? We all crash our face at sometimes. And knowing what to do on it is important. So incidents are investments that you've already made. So ensure you get return on your investment. Right? Incidents already happen. So find ways to actually benefit from them. Identify the problems that happen. Talk with people. Understand how they felt. All those things are important to in your long-term sustainability and the resilience of the systems that you're building. And don't just do the bare minimum, right? At least identify what contributed to the failure. And that's, so as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been doing a lot of reading and writing on safety and resilience engineering. So root causes aren't usually root causes. There are usually lots of contributing factors. Do a bit of work to try and understand what contributed to the failure. Right? And not just don't get the easy excuse of oh, it was that problem, we'll fix that one thing and that's over. Over time you'll see that it pays a lot in terms of return on investment if you try and understand a bit more of the things that contribute to failure. And what I call the golden rule, which particularly in a startup can completely build or break a good culture of dealing with things going wrong, which is, I really love this quote from Nancy Leifson. She wrote some brilliant books on safety engineering. So human error is a symptom of a system in need of redesign. Right? So don't just blame people, right? Even if it was what, unfortunately, most of our industry still defaults to it was a human error. It was the guy that did a thing or the girl that did the thing. As management, you need to understand that it's not just people. People exist in a socio-technical context, right? And that means that if a human error is possible, it's likely that the system that you, the manager, design isn't good enough, right? Or isn't, or has a lots of room for improvement. So let's not just go get the easy way out and point to a human error. Let's try and identify the things that contributed to that error happening. And understand that particularly in startups, there's a lot of pressure, right? You're always trying to do things as fast as possible. You're going to have lots of commercial opportunities that you're going to be pursuing. Many of those you're not going to get through, but you're probably trying to do things to convince those prospects that that they should be doing business with you. So understand that this is a lot of pressure for teams, and that mistakes will happen, things will go wrong, right? So ensure that you build in this culture that even when things go wrong, that people can talk about it, they can improve, they can identify contributing factors, and that this is embedded into the way you think about your engineering efforts. So even if you do need a consultant in getting external support, be clear about what you want. So what have we talked about now? I've given you pointers to tools that you can use across infrastructure and application building on the 4 things. There's a lot to go on here, right? I'm sure that for most startups, just with the information that we've talked about here, you can probably have a good enough 6 to 9 months of work that you could start doing tomorrow if you wanted to. So the good thing about that as well, and this is about my overall goal of trying to democratize access to security information, is that you don't need a consultant just to tell you what these best practices are. I just told you, and you can do that by yourself. You can Google, right? So what you do have is once you identify there are things that are being particularly difficult to your organization to do, then go and try to fix that one thing, right? But this puts you in the driver's seat of not just let's bring in a consultant and tell me what I need to do. You can start from the point of these are the things, the basic things we want to be doing. Can you help me do this one because we're not figuring it out? And you can be very specific about what it is that you need support with. So focusing in when you get people externally, don't get them to do things, get them to try and facilitate the learning of things by your teams, right? Because again, 1 to 100, you're not going to get an army of security people, so you need to find ways to be as self-sufficient as possible in building the knowledge into your current teams that things are made sustainable, right? You need to always be thinking about how you can get them the right knowledge in at the time that people need it, and that means not relying on external consultants. That means your teams having the skills to actually do it themselves. And so, wrapping up, for startups, our initial mileage is going to be yours to walk, right? So bringing security expertise too early is detrimental for what we talked about. Role identity is what people see as their job. The basics are well documented, so you don't need consultants or staff to tell you what those are, and you can leverage open source resources. When you do get stuck, at least now you know exactly what it is that you need help with, and you can start getting people to help you with that 1 or 2 things specifically that you know you need help with. And if you don't have any security items on your backlog, then you're just talking about it, right? So things don't happen on spreadsheets, etc. They're going to be there to gather dust and not happen, right? So if it's not on your backlog, if all of these security things that we've just talked about, if they don't make it as items on your backlog, then you're not doing security. You're just talking about it. And another reminder, keep calm and add security things to a managed backlog, right? So don't just add things in there to die. Add them and make sure that they are made part of the things that are considered when you are planning sprints. Okay, so now that you are going to have not only the bugs, the improvements, the feature work that you need to do for the products that you're building, you're going to have some security stuff in there, and that empowers not only management but also product owners to look at their security backlog and see, okay, and be responsible about it, because at the end of the day, either they prioritize it or they don't. It's either important for the organization or it's not. But at least now you have what I like to call the level playing field. So you've got things on your backlog, and then you can all be have grown-up conversations of, does it make sense to prioritize this now over a potential business opportunity? Sometimes the answer may be yes, the answer may be no, but at least people now have the data to make informed decisions, right? And at the end of the day, that's what security functions are here to do, is to support informed decision-making by people making business decisions. And that is it from me. So another thing that I'd like to talk about, so I've just released at Practical DevSecOps a course called Certified DevSecOps Leader. So it's about applying management principles. So it talks about Cynefin that we just touched on the surface with the animal analogies, worldly mapping for developing strategy and architecture, influencing culture, and how to approach governance, risk, and compliance from a DevSecOps perspective. So this is now available, and would be great to have you as students as part of the community. And now it's time for Q&A. Thank you very much for taking the time. You can find me on social media. On Twitter is where I'm most active, and you can find me at Platt. So if there are any questions, I'm going to stick around to have a conversation with a few more of you. Thank you very much. Cheers.